My job at the session was to sit at the far end of the table, keep the record, and not speak unless spoken to. That suited me fine. I had been the junior archivist on the joint diplomatic staff for 3 years by the time the Vethrani delegation came to Harrow Station, and I had learned early that the less visible you are in a room full of people who enjoy talking, the more you hear. I kept a tidy log. I asked no questions. I poured nobody's water because that was not my job, but I refilled my own quietly and I watched, and I wrote down everything that was said. The Vethrani were the smooth-skinned kind, pale as chalk, tall enough that the standard station chairs looked like children's furniture under them. Their faces arranged in that particular expression of polite patience that, I had come to understand, was the Vethrani way of showing you that they were not particularly impressed. Their senior delegate was called Assessor Tavan Meth. He had 3 staff with him. They all wore gray. They all held their hands folded on the table in exactly the same way, and when our lead negotiator, Director Hollenbeck, opened the session with the standard welcome in standard Terran, as Assessor Meth translated something quietly to his second, covered his mouth with 2 fingers. I wrote, 1041 hearts. Vethrani delegation reacts to opening address. The gesture I had learned to recognize by then. It meant something was funny. Hollenbeck did not notice. Or if he did, he gave no indication. He was a career diplomat, gray at the temples, entirely unflappable in the way that career diplomats either are or learn to perform so well it becomes the same thing. He laid out the human position in measured paragraphs, using the kind of language that diplomatic addresses use. Careful, slightly indirect, built with phrases like, "We hope to find common ground, and it is our sincere expectation and the spirit of mutual benefit." Standard form. Every civilization in the conference used language like that, except the Vethrani, who did not. Meth waited until Hollenbeck finished. Then he said, in serviceable Terran standard, that the Vethrani found the human diplomatic idiom somewhat. He paused, apparently selecting the word, decorative. He said this without looking at Hollenbeck. He was consulting his tablet. His second made a sound. The third member of the delegation studied the ceiling. Hollenbeck said, pleasantly, that he was happy to clarify any phrasing that required it. Meth said that was not necessary. He said that the Vethrani simply preferred to proceed directly. He used the Vethrani word for directly and then translated it himself as, without the additional material. There was a particular emphasis on those last 2 words that I noted down and that Hollenbeck, to his credit, absorbed without visible reaction. I wrote, Vethrani delegation characterizes Terran diplomatic language as superfluous. That set the tone for the next 2 hours. Face and H staff has come for a transit rights renegotiation. Specifically, the corridor through the Asha Belt, human survey teams had been using under a provisional agreement for 11 years. The Vethrani wanted the corridor reclassified as Vethrani Territorial Passage, with human access granted by permit, reviewed annually. Hollenbeck's position was continued shared use, no reclassification. Neither side was going to move far from that, which both sides knew, which meant the session was really about establishing terms for the negotiation, rather than concluding one. The Vethrani used this time to be educational. Meth explained, at one point, that human negotiators tended to use metaphor as a structural device, which the Vethrani found difficult to parse in formal context. He cited common ground specifically. He asked, in a tone that suggested genuine curiosity, whether the metaphor was derived from agriculture. When Beck said it was a general expression of shared interest, Meth nodded slowly and wrote something down. His second was not covering his mouth anymore. He had given up the pretense and was simply watching Hollenbeck with an expression I could only describe as the way you look at something that is trying very hard. Later, Meth observed that human legal language was similarly. He found another word, layered. He said this while reviewing the draft framework that our office had submitted that morning. He held the tablet slightly away from himself, as if the layering might be contagious. His third said something in Vethrani primary that made the second exhale through his nose. I had been taking notes for 2.5 years in Vethrani primary dialect by that point. I had started because one of the senior archivists had recommended it. Said you never knew what you might overhear, and then I had kept going, because I found it interesting. It was a precise language, very clean. Once you understood the grammatical case system, took about 6 months to stop fighting. It had a kind of elegance to it. Vethrani Primary was a language that did not like decoration. Every word had a job. There was no passive voice. There was no subjunctive mood for politeness. If you wanted to say a thing, you said it. The third had said, they write the way they think, broadly. Not cruel, exactly, observational. The delivery was the same flat tone the Vethrani used for everything. The same tone they used for route coordinates and treaty clauses and weather, ports. It was not designed to sting. It was simply what they thought, stated plainly, because that was how they spoke. I had spent 2.5 years learning to appreciate that about them. But the second had exhaled, and Meth had not corrected either of them. And there are things you write down in the formal log and things you carry with you for other reasons. I wrote down, third delegate comments on Terran cognitive approach. I left it at that. At 13:17 hours, Meth asked that we pause for the afternoon recess and reconvene after the station's evening meal. Hollenbeck agreed. As the room cleared, Meth said to the room in general, not to Hollenbeck specifically, which was its own kind of thing, that they would look forward to reviewing any revised language the human delegation wished to present. He made the Vethrani gesture that meant approximately, if you feel it would help. I looked at Hollenbeck across the emptying table. He looked at me. Sarah, he said, I think we may want to revisit the framework introduction. I said I thought so too. We spent the recess in the small conference room off the main chamber. Hollenbeck dictated, I drafted. We went back and forth 3 times. He had 40 years of diplomatic experience. I had 3 years of archival work, 2.5 of Vethrani Primary, and a reasonably clear sense of what the problem was. By the time the station's evening meal had come and gone, we had something different. It was shorter, it was more direct. It cited in order the 3 specific clauses of the Vethrani Corridor Rights Compact of 2213 that the Vethrani delegation's reclassification proposal would require, amending, with the amendment thresholds those clauses specified. We reconvened at 1900 hours. The delegation filed back in. Meth folded his hands on the table. Hollenbeck said that we had prepared a revised statement of the human position and asked that it be read into the shop. He nodded at me. I had the tablet. I stood, protocol for formal record entry, and I read the statement aloud, in Vethrani Primary dialect, the standard pace for legal citation. It took 47 seconds. I set the tablet down and sat. The room was quiet for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for any procedural reason. Meth's second had both hands flat on the table. Third was looking at Meth. Meth was looking at me. The way you sound, it's something you have been holding from yourself and are revising your assessment of. Hollenbeck said pleasantly that he was happy to clarify any phrasing that required it. Nobody laughed. Nobody covered their mouth. Meth looked at the tablet in front of for several seconds, then looked back up. He said, in Terran Standard, that clarification was not necessary. The session ran another 40 minutes. At the end of it, Meth requested a 1-week recess for the Vethrani delegation to consult with the Home Authority. Hollenbeck agreed. They shook hands in the Terran way, which the Vethrani had learned to do and executed with the same precise, slightly effortful correctness they brought to everything. I was logging the session close when Meth paused at the door. He looked back at me, not at Hollenbeck, at me, and said in Vethrani Primary, the phrase that translates most accurately as, more than it appeared. He said it without particular inflection, observational, same as before. Then he left. They signed the revised chat shared use framework 11 days later. No reclassification, continued access, no annual review. The Vethrani delegation departed Harrow Station on the morning of the 12th day, filed the session logs, updated the archive, and poured myself a coffee. It tasted the same as it always did.